Bam. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome back to Mythic Mission with Professor Michael Jahoski. Ooh, it is a welcome back. It's been a little over a month since our last episode. I think early June. The kids have been keeping us on our toes. Let's see, Lucas, Taekwondo. Annabelle was swim first. Now she can't stop swimming, which is great. She's diving, jumping, playing with her brother, and now she's gotten into tap and ballet. So we have had our hands full for the last 5 weeks. We've also taken the kids through a journey on Narnia, Middle Earth, and Ere We Are, if anybody's familiar with the Wingfeather Saga books, which are highly recommended. So we have a good excuse for the gap in between episodes, but we are so pleased today to introduce our special guest for episode 23 of Mythic Mission, Professor MaryJo Sharp. And after I read a brief introduction here, we'll jump into some questions. We've got a lot of really great topics for you today. If you are watching on Facebook Live, please put in the comment section any questions you have for Professor Sharp, or if you're family, you can just text them to me. That's fine. Okay. So let's go ahead and get started. A former atheist who came to faith, Professor MaryJo Sharp has experienced two worlds of American culture: the post-Christian culture of the Pacific Northwest and the evangelical culture of the Bible Belt. She first encountered apologetics in her own spiritual search while seeking answers. MaryJo is now an assistant professor of apologetics at Houston Baptist University and is the founder and director of Confident Christianity Apologetics Ministry. She has been featured in Christianity Today's cover story, The Unexpected Defenders, and is an international speaker on apologetics, focusing on love and logic to uncover truth. She lives with her husband and family in Portland, Oregon, and you'll be able to connect with MaryJo on social media and her website, which I'm going to put in the show notes for today. And you can get those later. We'll be on YouTube and all the platforms where you get your podcast later on today. Welcome, MaryJo. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so I have been hopping around your book and really enjoying it. Sarah's been reading it too, so I know she has some questions for you that she's going to be sending in. And I was really taken in, especially by the beginning and I think chapter 9 on beauty. So I know we'll get to talking about that a little later on today. But as you know, I just wanted to ask, and I ask all of my guests this, if they feel comfortable talking about their journey to Christ. And, you know, you lay this out in your most recent book, Why I Still Believe. And why did you ultimately, I guess this is the real question, why did you ultimately remain a Christian instead of looking at things differently, remaining an atheist?
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's get after this, huh?
Yeah.
Wow, there's so many things to think about here, but I was raised outside of church. So my family had stopped going to church when I was very young. And as your introduction mentioned, I was raised in the Pacific Northwest in the Portland area. Mm-hmm. So I like to describe this to people. There are Christians up here. It's just that it has more of the feel of a post-Christian environment where it's not culturally Christian, like my experience in the South, where so many people went to church. And I remember when I went off to college and I started meeting people, and like everybody seemed to have a church experience, and that was odd to me. So that's sort of what I mean by the post-Christian feel of the Pacific Northwest. So I was raised in that environment, and while I wasn't raised with a church background or like this deep understanding of Christianity, I did have a family that loved the arts and sciences so much. And my dad was a huge Carl Sagan fan, and we watched a lot. He loved anything he could get his hands on about outer space. I have a picture of him laying on a beach in Oregon with Cosmos, just across his chest. It was kind of a big book, so he had it there. Yeah. It's great.
That's cool.
But so my background was steeped in a healthy respect of nature, a love of the beauty and that mankind could achieve through the arts, and a wonder at the universe in which I lived. And so those things I think were pushing me on to wondering what this was all about, what it was all for, to being very curious.
Yeah. Well, could I interject real quick?
Sure.
I think in the first few pages, you talk about music being your, hearing the calling of the transcendent. And as I told you before we started, this made me think of a comment, and it always really sticks with my students too. They love this quote from The Weight of Glory by C.S. Lewis. And it just reminded me of that. I'm not into music anymore. I used to play alto sax back in the day. I don't even have an instrument anymore, but I want to pick it up again. But I understood what you were talking about. But this quote, just a small portion, Lewis writes, "The books or the music in which we thought the beauty was located will betray us if we trust them. It was not in them, but it only came through them, and what came through them was longing." And that really made me think of that quote when you shared that experience. That was your, first calling.
Yeah.
And you talk about, nature in the Northwest, and there's some really great things. We'll return to this a little later on when we talk about, narrative imagination and such. But was there anything else you wanted to share about your background that you think?
Oh yeah, sure. So that's a great quote. It's hard not to jump right to that.
Oh, I know.
But it did push me on to wondering what was behind all the beauty and what was it all for? What was our pursuit of the good and the true about, and where did I get these ideas from? And right about that time when I'm getting old enough as a teenager that I'm having these thoughts, my mind is forming. And I have a Christian high school band director. I also played saxophone, by the way.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, I still play. Yeah.
Oh, nice.
Very badly. I still play very badly. But
if you say that about you can imagine how bad if I tried.
Well, we can pick it back up pretty quickly. The problem is you lose your muscle, your lip.
I know.
So
for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. But so my high school band director was a Christian man, and he was very burdened for me. And he was very, he's cautious about witnessing to a public school student because he told me he feared that he could lose his job if he did this. But he was just so strongly burdened for me that my senior year of high school, he gave me a Bible, and he said, "When you go off to college, you're going to have hard questions. I hope you'll turn to this." And that was like, he hit me at the right time when I did have hard questions. I respected him very much. So much as a music educator that I went into music education. So my undergrad is actually music, and I taught band in the public schools.
Oh, so cool.
Yeah. So I don't even know if I put it in the book, but I did. Okay. I taught for a while. So he's a very influential person in my life, and he just hit me at the right moment. So I started to read the Bible, and it started to make sense of all of those experiences I was having and those questions. So when I went off to college, I actually did the opposite of what we worry about. I explored faith, and, for the first time on my own, I was out there like asking the hard questions and going to church on my own for the first time. And it was in college where I became a Christian. So you had asked, like, ultimately, why did I choose Christianity instead of remaining an atheist?
Well, yeah. Like what keeps you looking at the world through Christ's, vision? I mean, there's so many options today. And, I've got students all the time heckling me in the back of the class. What about Pastafarianism? I'm like, come on. So why not Pastafarianism is really the question I meant to ask.
Spaghetti monster.
Yes.
The flying spaghetti monster. So what happened to me after I became a Christian has to do with why I'm kind of still a Christian, which was that I went through a crisis of faith based on the hypocrisy that I experienced with believers in the church. So what drew me to the church was the good, true, and beautiful. I wouldn't have framed it that way, but that's kind of what drew me, is God himself and what he was teaching me through the Bible. What I found in the church was so mismatched to that. It really didn't make sense of the people who professed the Bible is true. To me, didn't seem to even make a serious attempt to live as though those beliefs were true. So to me, I thought, they don't seem to believe this. This is more of like a social club or the way they were raised or something. So I started to direct that doubt back to myself. Well, why do I believe it? What happened when I accepted Christ? Was that real? And I started asking myself questions about how do I know Jesus rose from the dead? Or how do I know God exists? And it's not the flying spaghetti monster. That wasn't around back then, but that's one of my favorite atheist like fairy tales is the flying spaghetti monster. So
me too.
Anyway, but I asked those questions and I came to this thought, the litmus test for the truth of Christianity couldn't be the behaviors of Christians. So I really needed to figure out whether Christianity I would have just said was true or not. So I was looking for, was it objectively true? Even though my subjective experience of it had been tainted. So that's what I was looking for. And I started to find answers to my questions. And those answers were so strong for me that I got to the point where I couldn't intellectually deny the existence of God, even though I didn't necessarily want to find that he existed. I kind of wanted the atheist arguments to be stronger, and because I was upset with the church. And in the end, though, I hit these roadblocks to disbelief, and that was through my search in apologetics.
Yeah, and I've thank you so much for sharing that. I found that maybe it was Nancy Piercy in whom I read it first, but I think she has a section in Finding Truth about studying your way back to God. But I always thought, that really was what it was for me, is the more I studied apologetics, the more secure I felt, the more that I felt that Christianity could offer really good answers. And, just asking questions and studying and exploring. And as I did humanities, I was doing a lot of that. So it really was helpful to me. I have a very different story, of course, but I can understand some of the power and things that you've said, especially for a lot of people listening. I know, the subjective experience in church, including our own family, is so disappointing, that gap between what it ought to be and what it is. And I think you mentioned that somewhere in your book too. And it's one of the big objections I get from my kids in class, well, how come Christians are so, poorly behaved or bad or whatever? Sometimes it's more colorful language, as you probably know, and with your own students. So, it's something I totally get. And I didn't plan to ask you this, but I know you were friends with Nabil Qureshi. And we really enjoyed his books, especially because I lived in Saudi Arabia for a few years and grew up among Muslims. And so when I found out who he was back in the day, I was like, I got to read this guy's books because it was just such an interesting premise. Did he have any, support in your story? I mean, was it because of his friendship, maybe?
Okay. I typically blame not only Nabil, but also David Wood, his friend, for getting me wrapped up in ministry.
That's a good thing to blame him for.
Yeah, it really was my husband who initially got involved with youth ministry. But then when I was going through this time of doubt, I actually went to get a degree that, I felt like it could help me explore these doubts. So I went and got a degree in apologetics. And during my time at the university, Nabil was also going there. So I met him and David. And through those two, what was so impacting to me about both of them was, first of all, they were such big personalities, right? Just huge personalities, very passionate about what they believed. And secondly, they were the first two people that I met that really valued me for who I was as a Christian thinker and academic, and really helped me to grow in that, and taught me to actually work on that and use that, and didn't just see me as a person to fill a spot in a church, but actually God's gifted you in this way. You need to use that, and pushed me into it. So Nabil is actually responsible for my first debate because he publicly challenged me to do it. So, but
for it. That's good.
Yeah, those two, I worked with them a lot. If you go back and look at their debates, David and Nabil's debates in like the 2009, 2008 era, you'll see me doing moderating and helping them with all of that. Yeah.
I think I might have come across a video or two, but we've been in our own house. I think our own first encounter with your books. Thank you for talking about Nabil. It was so tragic what happened to him and his life being clipped so short. The first encounter we had with your books actually was, I think, Why Do You Believe That? It was a workbook. We were walking into a Lifeway when they were still around locally, and we really enjoyed working through that together. So that was our first encounter with your work. We really enjoyed that. So
thank you.
Yeah, of course. Well, let's move on to what projects you're working on these days. I mean, I just want to ask this now because I don't want to not have time for it. So what are you up to these days? I know you're teaching at HBU.
Right? Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about that. But,
please. Yeah, could you?
So I am a professor of apologetics at Houston Baptist University. And I've been there since the start of the apologetics program. That's what I was brought on to help with, was to develop that degree. Yeah.
How long has that been?
I've been there since 2012, but the degree started in spring of 2013. So
cool.
It's been going for a while.
Yeah, that's great.
And it's a fully online degree. It's a 36-hour master's degree, and it has really great faculty. So it's it's been such a great experience of growing in faith and ministry with like-minded Christians, both for the professors and the students. I know it's been mutually beneficial. So I've been doing that, still doing that.
Good.
My most like exciting thing I'm up to right now is called the Savvy Project. And I've been working on it for about a year. And so you guys can check it out at savvyproject.org. But it's a 16 video series on apologetics that's driven by Gen Z narratives. Wow. So we actually put a call out across the country to get these stories from Gen Z youth who were Christians, and to ask them what are they struggling with? What's their church experience like? What's their background? And so all of the videos are based on one of those real life stories. And each video offers like sort of invitational, it's like sort of invitational to come with us into discussing these questions. We try not to lecture as much as we try to help kids be curious about faith. So I really like that. And we're about to we're about to premiere our pilot episode, The Message, How Christianity is Different. So I'm really excited. We have a top flight production team on that. So it's going to be, I hope, super impacting in the world of apologetics and in Christianity in general. So that's one thing.
Okay. Wow. Fantastic.
And then you've mentioned my book, Why I Still Believe. So that came out in November of 2019, right before the pandemic.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Just in time.
Yeah. Your book came out during the pandemic. So yeah.
I know. Yeah. It was nutty.
Yeah. So that's still like sort of newish because of COVID. And
absolutely.
That book is my deconstruction story based on my experience of hypocrisy in the church, and then of my own story of coming back around to belief in God. And again, I try to be invitational and not wrap everything up for everybody. So
yes, it's something I know I've learned the hard way. And even in my own book, as I was writing it, I remember thinking, gosh, there's so much that we need to tell people, but there's so much of a draw from just drawing people into a story and getting them to experience that. I know we're going to get to this soon, but I've learned in personally working with people and doing apologetics in my own little bubble, it's infinitely better to draw people in and give them a taste of what it is like to be a disciple of Christ than to just tell them, here's what you need to do to believe, here are all the facts. And I know that some people really respond well to that. And I'm a logical person too, and I'm sure you find yourself to be, but I know you're also drawn to the beautiful, the imaginative. So I've just found it's much more successful to really try to invite people. So that sounds great. And do you mind if I include a mention of the Savvy Project in the show notes?
Oh yeah, please do.
Yeah,
love to have people use that.
Yeah, absolutely. Want to make people aware that it exists. So that's wonderful. Well, I guess the first major question that I have for you, if we can move into that, unless there's anything else you wanted to share.
Oh no, that's good.
Okay.
So many things. There's so many things going on.
That's okay. Well, people can check you out on your website. They can see what else you've got going on. I guess this is the topic that I know a lot of people in my family are interested. What unique strengths might women bring to apologetics? Because there's no disagreement, as God's imagers, men and women both need to be, doing apologetics. And so, maybe what is apologetics? So is there a unique skill set or strengths that women can bring to doing apologetics, do you think? Could we speak to that for a little bit?
Yeah. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a caveat because, I don't like to stereotype. So, because there's always those who break that stereotype. And to me, this is fun because part of my Myers-Briggs personality is my type is an NT, which pretty much guarantees that in stereotypes, I think more like a male than I do a female. And I've found that, a lot in my experience. But
yes,
I will say, having said the caveat, in my experience, women typically ask me questions about the faith because they are concerned for someone who is struggling with the faith. So they typically come at this endeavor with a relational approach. And that's been my experience more so than with men, like with guys in general, is that they are actually specifically thinking, I want to help X person, whoever that is. It might be themselves, it might be their spouse, whatever. So I think this is a strength because they bring into the apologetic endeavor this concern for specific people in their own community. And I think that's going to affect how they present their apologetic arguments.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they're considering the best ways to talk to somebody when they are thinking about presenting an argument. So, they're starting from the point of how can I best help someone rather than how can I just best argue this point? Like how, a lot of times when we get into apologetic arguments, we think, what's the strongest argument I can make? I want to make sure nobody can get around this. And I want to close all the holes and answer all the objections.
Yes.
And that's not, I'm not trying to devalue that. That's actually very important. But at the same time, who are you arguing with? And I think this is the thing that I've seen over and over from women. One of the strengths they bring in is they're considering who's at the other end of your statements of the argument. And so they bring in a very, like I said, relational approach in that I need to make my argument strong for the purpose of, and it's going to be for the sake of others. So
powerful.
I think that's an important thing that women have to bring to this. And again, it's a stereotype. Men can do this as well.
Of course.
But I've found just in my experience of speaking to different audiences, women almost always say, my husband has left the faith. My child has left the faith. So they're approaching it from that specific position.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm glad you, issued the caveat. I've been reading up about this, and I don't intend to go down this path or anything, of course, but Preston Sprinkle, I think, released a book called Embodied, and I'm trying to read here and there, getting into who's been talking about this subject. But I found it fascinating that a lot of Christians are resistant to that idea that, yes, men and women have different strengths, but there's also a lot of overlap. It is a stereotype. I mean, because men can be relational too, but I think it's still a good question because, I've talked to a lot of women that just feel like, well, maybe this isn't something I should be doing. I shouldn't be thinking critically. And I'm thinking, I don't know, that's not the direction we want people to be going in.
I keep thinking of this from like a philosophical perspective, more like a possibly philosophical theology viewpoint, which is that if you're made in the image of God and you're given rationality, which is part of being made in the image of God, then what are you to do with that rationality? And, if you're thinking about the Westminster Confession about, what's the purpose of man and all this sort of to enjoy God, right? And so your rationality is at least in part for us to be able to enjoy God. And part of how we do that as women as well is to know him. And how we know God in some ways is reading the scripture and letting the Spirit, work in our lives. Another way is in thinking through our faith at a very deep level. So theology, philosophy, all of those things, that's just part of being human. And it's not specific to males or females.
No, I agree. And I don't know if it's because certain people are working with stereotypes against them, but even just in my own personal circle, I've found a lot of resistance again, it's men and women, but this resistance to thinking critically and deeply, like, well, not everyone likes to think this deeply. And I'm thinking, but you need to, you ought to. And I think it dawns on everybody at a certain point. And I've been torn in my own approaches to say, do I keep pushing with this person or do I let the Holy Spirit work? And, there's this tendency in doing apologetics to sometimes think that you're the Holy Spirit and it's your job to change the mind of whoever you care about. So this just opened up a whole bunch of, questions I had, but setting those aside, I really like what you've said. I think it also ties into just this word relational. Women almost seem perhaps, again, with the stereotype in mind, to think more imaginatively in being relational, and caring about people walking away from the story of faith. It almost seems like maybe for certain people, we need to really be careful about how we tailor our message. Male or female, of course, there's a lot of plasticity there, but with whether this person needs a rational argument or maybe a story to get them to understand what it is we're trying to say. So I think relational concern and imagination seem to go hand in hand, at least to me.
I think so too. Creativity and how you're presenting, what you're presenting as an educator. So I mentioned early on that I had taught music in the public schools. So I have
Yes.
a music education background, and that education part taught me that you need to consider who is in your, we'll just use like a presenter language, who's in your audience.
Mm-hmm.
So, or relational language, who are you speaking to? You need to consider what the best way is to reach them with where they're at.
Exactly.
And that's where the creativity can come in, and that you're not just downloading, information to them, but there's a way to bring that to them.
Yep.
And being creative in how you communicate that with the person in front of you and where they're at, how they can understand things is important. Yeah, it's an important piece. That's an important piece of our apologetic arguments.
Well, I certainly agree with you. I mean, think of Paul in Acts 17 on the Areopagus. I think that, if anything, says creating the message for the audience. It's not changing the message, but it's finding a way to fit that message of Christ into the arts. He's pointing to a statue of an unknown God, and he's quoting Greek poets, and he's showing, hey, I understand where you're coming from. So he seems to really know his audience. Of course, I beelined right to Paul, but Jesus is the primary example of this, just in telling parables and knowing his audience. So I think that's super important in how we create the message. So yeah, thank you for speaking to that. Any other, maybe unique, stereotypical contributions, perhaps, that we could talk about, or?
I like how we've caveated so much. We are caveating.
We are caveating.
Yeah. A lot of it is because we're struggling. There's so much we're struggling right now within culture.
I know.
On this matter. So
indeed.
No, I think I'm good.
Okay. Yeah. So don't choke on me. Well, since we've spoken,
Sorry.
No, of course, we've spoken a little bit about the imagination and beauty. I just wanted to ask you, because given the name of the podcast, we always like to design questions for our guests to just see if they've heard of this concept of mythos, or myth. Is obviously, we usually don't use the Greek, but in your own training or upbringing in apologetics, do you have any familiarity with that idea? Myth as story, as it relates to doing apologetics?
I have a little bit.
Yeah, I figured you did. That's why I asked.
What do you want? Where do you want to go?
Well, I mean, I would say, what would be the advantages, do you think, to drawing people in via a story rather than, as you said earlier, I like the way you put it, kind of downloading, facts and rational arguments, because I think that was a very powerful insight.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of benefits. Myth kind of gets a bad rap as a word in our culture, because it kind of carries the baggage of, those people who just didn't have knowledge. And so they ascribed, thunder to God's anger or whatever. And, they try to explain things away in the with these simplistic stories. So that's sort of the modern myth of our time, is that myth itself. That term has been very much broadened out to mean a whole bunch of different things, and we're sort of confused with what it is. So it can mean different things. Yes, and when you look at what Peter was saying, I believe it's in 2 Peter 1:16, where he's saying, we didn't tell you like a false myth or these myths of the gods. He's meaning false tales, right? These false tales of the gods. So right there, we can see that Peter is saying there are some things kind of like how we're defining myth, in that these are false tales. These are not true. That's not what we're saying about Jesus, is what Peter's saying. We're not making up stuff here to explain things away. But like I said, that's kind of generally how people view that word.
Isn't that true?
But myth can have, and I think that's probably in part a fallout from the Enlightenment and the modern era, modernist thinking, empiricism.
Definitely.
Where if you go back to Romanticism and the existentialists, they don't view myth like that. So, so here's more of where they would go, which is that it can have a community and religious, as a sort of a community benefit for people, and that it's more than just a false tale. There's something else going on. So,
yeah. I think that's a super great introduction to this. And it was Alistair McGrath who really, I think, turned me on to thinking this way first. I think I encountered it in the Intellectual Life of C.S. Lewis book. I think it's he's got a lot of books, but his recent one is on narrative apologetics, which has a lot of the arguments in those earlier books. But what I thought was probably the most profound insight is that we're all working inside myths, understood as grand story or narrated worldview. And so in one sense, you're right. In the second Peter, you're so right that there Peter's saying, we're not telling you a lie. We're not lying to you. We're not telling you a story that's really just a gotcha. But we are telling you a story. It is a myth. It's just not a false myth. So to kind of build on what you said, I would say for those of us listening, we're all living inside a story. What Peter, I think, was saying is, there are some that live within narratives about the world that don't really correspond to the way things are, i.e. false stories. And then there are those that tell a better story and make more sense. And we're not telling you the former, we're telling you the latter. But make no mistake, everybody is inside a story, just not maybe the same story. Of course, not the same story. We know everybody is working within a different framework. So I've always gravitated toward the idea of myth as narrated worldview as a really powerful apologetic tool. So do you see that having any worth? Can you look on your ministry? Do you see yourself using that idea?
Yes, definitely. That's you're going right to Lewis, who had the myth made fact, and he saw a lot of the world's tales as though they're all trying to get to the one great story. They're all trying to tell the same tale, but they don't all have it, true. There's some things that have gone astray. Some have partial truth, and but this, for me, I think it's difficult when we hear the word myth. It's just so tough for us. And I actually appreciate that, the work that you've been doing, so that you can help people see the not broader, but a more narrow, not a narrow, more, I'm trying to find the word I'm looking for. It's not coming, but you're helping to define this term myth, to help us sort of reclaim it, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. And there are benefits to it, because for one, I sort of agree with Lewis in that, I probably wholly agree with Lewis in that we're all trying to tell the same story. And as you look throughout all of our stories across time and history, you keep finding the same ideas, that there's something wrong here in the world. There's something wrong with mankind. It keeps doing the wrong stuff. What's the solution? What's the answer to all this pain and suffering that we're going through? And how do we get here? Where are we going? These are all the same things that every story is trying to answer. So I think C.S. Lewis hit that dead on.
I agree.
So I haven't gotten to benefits of it yet, but do you want to go there?
Well, no, I wanted to just pick your brain a little bit and just see, I don't know if you want to touch this subject or not, but Lewis's idea of, and maybe some listening might benefit from this, because I'm sure you get this question all the time. Not only is Christianity just another false story, but what is the relationship of the Christian worldview to other traditions? Is there not truth and goodness and beauty in those? So I remember the line from Myth Made Fact, or I'm confusing Marcos's book now with Lewis's essay. Myth Became Fact.
There it is.
In God in the Dock, Lewis says, I think something along the lines that God sent the pagan poets good dreams and implanted, not the very real, but images of the same story, but just they're fuzzier because, of course, there's this idea that we're all made in God's image, but God revealed himself directly to Israel ultimately. But because he created everybody in his image, all of us are reaching out to him. He's not very far from us. So there is, I think, tucked away in this insight that Lewis talks about again and again, for those of you that don't know, in that essay and elsewhere, that there is truth, goodness, and beauty to be found in other traditions. Would you agree with that? And do you talk about this at all?
I do a little bit when I do my pagan myth, the copycat theory. I'm addressing the copycat theory, where Christianity is not a copy of these other religions. And that's sort of like when you go back to Acts 17, which you mentioned earlier, that's sort of what you see happening there is these guys are like, wait a minute, is he just putting together a whole bunch of different religions? They're trying to figure out what he's doing. And then they get confused. They're like, wait a minute, this is different. You're bringing strange new things to our ears. And so when I address the copycat theory, I'm like, well, look, these very well-trained men across, in the center of intellectualism in the ancient world, they're looking at Paul like, what is this? So while I say I kind of have this, what we've been talking about, where there is truth out there, that God has, written the moral law on the hearts of everybody, and he's calling everybody to himself. And Romans 1 speaks about that God has made himself known through everything that's out there, through general revelation. So that's one of the things I've had troubles with in evangelical Christianity, is they'll say that meaning well, they'll say 1% or 99% truth and 1% lie is still a lie. And I'm like, well, yeah, but then what does that do to, this idea that God has been drawing people to himself through all of these things, right? They don't, right. So they get sort of this black and white, like, just there's nothing good out there in anything else other than my view of God.
I have encountered that too.
Yeah. And I think it's born out of sort of a right heart to be righteous.
Of course.
But it has gone too far in that you need to understand that one denomination, one person doesn't have it all, because they're not God. They don't have a God perspective. So imagine that. Yeah, I think there is a lot to be learned from, these other traditions and how God has spoken to people through them. Because it does help. What it does is it helps us to, and here's where, so I kind of show that Christianity is very different in my talk. And I'll point out that even philosophically and theologically, it's vastly different than a lot of the pagan myths, because of God being transcendent in Christianity. He's not the one and the same. The divine doesn't flow in and out of nature like the pantheistic beliefs or the panentheism. So it's a very different system. But at the same time, God is revealing himself to other people. So there are truths out there to be found. And so that's kind of how I bring the two together. I was just going to say, for those of us listening who don't know about the copycat argument, I mean, I could summarize it, but I'd much rather you say it. But the gist that you've already kind of hinted at is that Christianity is just it's the Jewish version of the pagan myths, basically. It's just another story. Yeah. So is that pretty much a good summary? There's a negative element to the copycat theory, which is that the early writers of Christianity, these early authors, were actually knowingly stealing the other stories of Osiris and Mithras, and so that's the claim that's made. And then what happens is the person who's making the claim will show you like 12 or 24 or whatever characteristics of a myth that they've seen throughout all the other religions and stories. And then they'll show you how Christianity lines up with that. But in doing that, they're very abusive of the terms. So they'll say like everybody has a virgin birth. And so you go, oh, really? Okay, well, what's Mithras's virgin birth? Oh, he's jumping out of a rock as a pre-existent god in the underworld. He comes to this world jumping forth from a rock next to a river. And then he immediately goes into subduing the whole earth, like through battle. And you look at Osiris and the story of Horus. Osiris and Isis's child, Horus, is compared to Jesus. And he's ripping out of his mother's womb. Isis and Osiris are having intercourse in their goddess mother's womb as fetuses in order to birth, it's like to birth a Horus. And people are saying everybody has a virgin birth. When I look at that, I'm like, wait a minute, isn't virgin birth a human female who's never had sex before giving birth to a human child? Right? Exactly. So that's actually the Christian story, and it's not the others. And you can find out over and over, like Krishna is not virgin born, even though people will say that there were other babies before him from his mother, like over and over. So that's the problem.
That's such a wow. Yeah, I can see where people would go there, but there's an ignorance there of not reading these traditions. Just Hindu mythology, which I teach a lot about in my class, it's constantly evolved over thousands of years. There's been a lot of ad hoc adjustments too within the tradition, and people don't realize that Hinduism is not a monolithic religious term. There's Hinduism. So with that example with Krishna, that's just one piece. But I did want to say, and I think you'll like this, just because I quoted the weight of glory earlier. For those of you listening who have been intrigued by MaryJo's argument, and I know you've written and given talks about the copycat idea before in the argument, so you guys should really check that out. Lewis does say this. He says, we should expect, therefore, to find in the imagination of the great pagan teachers and myth makers some glimpse of that theme, which we believe to be the very plot of the whole cosmic story. the theme of incarnation, death, and rebirth. And the differences,
Yeah.
since you mentioned the pagan Christ, Balder, Norse mythology, Osiris, Egyptian mythology, and the
Yeah.
Christ himself is much what we should expect to find. The pagan stories are about somebody dying and rising, who knows when. The Christian story is about a historical person. And he goes on, and then he says, it is not the difference between falsehood and truth. I love this. It is the difference between a real event on the one hand, Christianity, and dim dreams or premonitions of that same event on the other. Chew on that for an afternoon. That's a lot.
Yeah, thank you. That's the best way to say all that stuff I was trying to say.
Lewis always had a way with words, but man, you'll sit and it's like a hard candy. You're on that for a whole day. It's a lot
and
of stuff there.
that actually addresses the what we were saying earlier about how people are they're trying to say that 99% truth and 1% lie is still a lie. Well, here's Lewis saying, well, come on, you got to think about what's happening in this grand narrative.
Exactly right. Yeah, I thought it would be a good way to tie together some of the great things you were saying. So thank you.
And
also,
we haven't done benefits.
No,
no. You want to talk about the benefits of this sort of narrative approach?
Yes, absolutely. So, storytelling is no joke. It's a less direct method of doing apologetics. So what might be the advantage and the benefit of taking that approach rather than just hammering away with propositional arguments?
Yeah. And I just really didn't want to miss this because
No.
It was so great. So for me, I think myth helps us to see the meta narrative of life, which we can be inattentive to due to all of like the responsibilities and activities that we do on this earth that are immediately before us. So it's sort of myth can help pull us out of the everyday and consider the beyond. And it develops our imagination, which we've been talking about. And what imagination does is it's a tool towards gaining understanding of things for which we don't have a lot of experience or limited understanding. So if you're wondering what that is, like, well, the spiritual realm, salvation, afterlife, unconditional love, things that are really, we learn them through our imagination, really, because human love is typically not unconditional. So how do we know about unconditional love? We have to imagine what it's like. And so the myth doesn't have to be something untrue, though. Like myth become fact. It can be the story of our lives passed along to others. And that's kind of what I'm seeing is valuable about my last book, is that there was a much bigger response to my own story and to the apologetic arguments interwoven into my life and what they meant for me, rather than just communicating an argument that's propositionally true or false. And so that narrative approach actually helped people imagine what it was like to go through this process of deconstructing a faith and then piecing back together my faith. And that helps them experience something that maybe they don't have experience with.
That's so well said. Yeah, and the imagination is that part of our mind Lewis called the organ of meaning that allows us, as you said, to picture things not immediately present, to consider new possibilities, and all of that is so true. Your book has done a remarkable job of doing that. In your beauty chapter, you share that story about with the dancers in John chapter 1, I think, and that really struck me, that you shared with a pastor. And did he say slutty or something to that extent? That the costumes were just inappropriate, and wow.
I wish he had said inappropriate. He called my my contribution, my artistic contribution, slutty, and it was actually quite conservative for what we were doing for dancers. So I brought something I thought was beautiful out of a worship of God, and a pastor called it slutty, which was so abrasive to me. And I at that time I didn't understand what was going on. Now I see the problem of not having an imagination, the problem of twisting and perverting beauty in the church, and how that's twisted our minds to see something that was innocent and beautiful as a perversion or as slutty.
Amen. Yeah, I was really struck by that. Just I tied that together with our talk on the imagination, because that was your attempt to through performing art, show, not just tell about. It was John chapter 1, right?
Creation.
Which is awesome, and that ties to Genesis. And so there's this great imaginative approach through what I teach in my classes, theater and dance and all that. and it was just shot down. And it basically kills the imagination, which I think is not the only issue we're facing, not only in the church, but outside the church today, but it's one of the biggest ones. We've just clipped the imagination out of things. So it's very tragic.
Well, and that's one of the problems with that, is then we become very pragmatic and utilitarian. And that's where the ends justifies the means, and Christianity cannot agree with that.
No, definitely not. So I'm sorry, I know we went on some tangents, but were there any other benefits? Good. So it's not so scripted. We wanted to be organic.
I think we covered it. Basically, we did the sort of the 30,000 foot look, but developing the imagination helps us to understand some of the harder concepts about God that are difficult to grasp. And then doing things through narrative, which I sort of related my own story to myth, because it is it's a telling of my life. Yep. And there's a greater story involved, and I'm part of a greater story, which gives it that myth element. And it helps people respond, because they don't have to. It's different when you're telling a story that has value in the relationship part, exactly. Right? Yeah. And there's something more about these arguments. They're not just propositional truths. It's not doing a math equation. Right. When I'm done with the Kalam argument, there's some value for how I'm going to live my life. When I'm done with the problem, I say done. Yeah. As I'm working on the problem of evil, that is going to seep into my narrative and the way that I live my life. And then eventually my story as it's passed along to other people.
Yeah, that's really well said. I think just one last thing I would add, when we're telling a story, especially as you've done in your book, you're not targeting an audience and saying, I'm after you, this is for you. You're talking in an indirect way that goes around and bypasses people's, whether they be emotional or intellectual or whatever arguments. And because it's not directed at somebody, and it's not like a book that's a debate, it's something that people feel less threatened by. And therefore, as you kept using the great word earlier, invitational. And that is why people, I think, ought to read your book, because it's putting everything we stand for here at the podcast in practice, and everything that Jesus stood for, the telling of stories to draw people in, which, 1/3 of the Gospels, for goodness sake, is parables. So that should tell us something, right?
Yes. So, that's actually, you brought up a good point. And I don't know the actual phrase, but it's the idea of sneaking past watchful dragons, right? So instead of going directly at something and then putting yourself in a defensive or aggressive posturing, by telling your story, you can address hard issues, but you kind of sneak past the direct approach. And so you're able to tell things that you may not be able to discuss directly through this sort of indirect or narrative approach.
Yep, couldn't agree more. So that's great. I think people are going to really have a great time with the benefits you shared. Even though it's a 30,000 foot view, it's a great view. And I think this is new to a lot of people. So I hope those of you listening are blessed by it and edified by what MaryJo has shared with us. And another practical question is our last question. And then I think we should have some time for some questions. I'll have to go log on and see if anybody has asked any. Just more practical wisdom. It doesn't have to be just for women, but I know that, that's helpful to just kind of say as an invitation, we all need to be joining in the task of doing apologetics, but whatever you like, any practical wisdom for studying and practicing apologetics, especially for busy moms. Just that's
oh yeah. Yeah, for every busy person. But I know that yours is more of a personal, like busy mom. So that's personal. Yeah. But I would say in studying, don't try to just enter apologetics from like everything at once. I would say find a question that either you have or someone has. And then let that question begin your study. So look at that. So I was looking at, how do I know Jesus rose from the dead? And then the other one was problem of evil for me. Why do I say something's good or bad? And so I started looking into that, and that guided where I was going to go, because you can get kind of lost. Apologetics covers so many categories that I would say, what is the question you're facing? Begin there. And that's a way to enter into apologetics if you're very busy, because it's motivational, right? Because that's something you actually care about. So you're going to spend some time with it. So that's, if you don't have a question, then ask somebody else, what's their biggest objection? And then go after that one.
That's great. Okay.
I would also recommend don't just read the apologetic arguments, but find those people who are connecting it back to your scripture so that you're getting the philosophical and the theological together. So how does this connect back to what Paul taught at Acts 17? Or, how does this connect back to the scriptures? Find those people, like, I think William Lane Craig does some of this where he actually connects it back. If you don't want to read William Lane Craig, there's a lot of other people out there, but yeah. And then go read that part of the scripture. Like, what's actually going on there? Because I think that helps bring you more of a holistic approach to your apologetics. And then for studying, look for what's missing in apologetics rather than for what has already, instead of just recycling what's already out there. What are we missing? Look for those spots where we've been a little bit blind and not arguing. We're not dealing with this over here. So that would be good. That's also practicing too, I guess. So practicing for busy people, start a group in your own church, just maybe at your house, and maybe it's always potluck. Maybe you never cook. And the people who come over bring food and all you're doing is just facilitating a discussion. Hallelujah. So yeah, start with a group in your own church that are kind of like-minded and interested in these things. If you have the desire, you can do Instagram, a lot of just passing along memes, get those ideas out there. That isn't, I'm amazed at how many people like just silly, fun memes. And then I just connect something back to scripture, or I connect it to an idea. So that's another way. Pretty good memes out there. There's a few meme lords that will remain unnamed that I won't mention on the air here, but you know who you are. And there's some pretty profound ones out there. Yeah, people are very creative. They are, yeah. So, and then as far as practicing, actively seek out constructive criticism, because that's how you get better. Some people don't want to be criticized, but you gotta jump the shark. For all you Happy Days fans out there, that's just a step you have to take. You have to be a person who's receptive to having your ideas critiqued. So as you practice, it's always good to find people, your husband, your wife, kids. I always used to practice on my own daughter to give me constructive criticism. Where have I gone wrong here? What do you see? Where is this flawed? I actually sought out atheists back on my debate group on Facebook way early in the day. When I would give a talk, I'd send it to them first and let them just hammer it. Wow. And so, well, they were great. They did a great job of showing me where I didn't see stuff. So that would be like the practical advice. I'll give you, you'd asked me for lessons. Yeah, any that you've learned. So yes. A big one that I'll try to say in a short form is that I have learned that either I believe in a fallen nature or I don't, but I can't have it both ways. So that means, here's where I apply it to apologetics. My rationality is also a part of my fallen nature. So I am prone to error. And the sooner that we grasp this, the better, because we're not always right in what we're thinking and in the way we're thinking it. And when you see some apologists online, you would think that we have to have everything figured out. That's not a great way to live. You don't have everything figured out because you're a fallen human being. So the quicker you can learn that and say, and take some humble pie when you're wrong about something, or when people point out, hey, this wasn't very thoughtful, the better, right? Because then you can open yourself up to more engagement that way. Absolutely. And on that note, don't be afraid to fail, because it won't make or break you. Yeah. I hope our son, Lucas, who's 7, is listening to that. He's hard on himself sometimes, and we have to routinely tell him this. I think he might have inherited that from me. We're like, how is that genetic? Like, you need to understand failures are, it's not like you want to wish for them, but you can learn so much from them. That is so profound. And I'm glad you mentioned just receiving criticism, being humble. These are such overlooked, like the golden rule. We sometimes just kind of say, oh yeah, I do that. Do you really? Yeah. That's really a tough one. If you think about the golden rule, to treat others the way you want to be treated. Not easy. We don't do that very often. No, I agree. Wow. Well, that's some really great practical information. I'm glad we'll have it recorded for people to go through and take notes, I hope. I was looking while you were talking. If there's anything else, please share while I'm looking here.
Let's see.
Oh, I will. Yeah, one more.
Yeah,
I
sure,
got one
please.
more.
Throw it in there.
I would also say be careful of where you spend your time, because some people will take advantage of you and they'll say it's for Jesus. And as a person who's been in ministry for 25 years, local church ministry, I just want to, I'll work it out this way. It's okay for you to take care of and provide for your family. It's always okay to do that.
Yeah.
So some people get caught in this like overly romanticized view of ministry, that they have to, their whole family has to be impoverished and they can't even afford to live in a house or put food on the table. And so they're always caught in this tension of trying to provide while trying to do what they love. It is okay for you to provide for your family. You should know that. That is a good and noble thing to do. Yeah.
Yeah. Very, very biblical too. You think of Adam in the garden, Eve in the garden. Timothy Keller's book, I think Every Good Endeavor has always been such a wonderful book for reminding us of that. I don't know if you've read it, but it's one of my favorites about the sanctity of work. So I would concur. I would so agree. And it's such a shame that is a thing we have to say, but it's good that you said it.
So it's okay for you to say no to stuff. That's kind of where we're going, is that, what's your mission? What do you want to do? And how do you want to provide for your family along the way? So it's okay to tell people, no, that's not within my scope.
Definitely. Thank you for sharing that. So my wife, Sarah, had asked a question. She said we already answered it, but do you have advice for moms trying to engage their young children? I don't know if I said the kids part. You mentioned your daughter, practicing on her, but any advice for teaching or engaging kids in apologetics?
Yeah. There's lots of great books out there now. When my daughter was young, we didn't have so much, but Dr. Craig's "What is God Like?" That series goes down to, "What is God Like?" by Dr. Craig, William Lane Craig's little kids series. And that's for the picture books. So as soon as you start reading books to kids, you can teach them about the nature of God, which is great. And then there are other books out there being put out by Mama Bear Apologetics and Natasha Crane's, Conversations to Have with Your Kids. She's got a couple of books out now. So you can use those. I took the approach of always being interested in what my kid was interested in and then leveraging that. So I have whatever she was reading in school, I read. So we read Pride and Prejudice together and Jane Eyre and all of her high school books. And then I found the apologetic value in those and I talked to her about it. So she knew what I was talking about because it was required for class. That's awesome. As they're, what is it that they are interested in? Is it gaming? I have found that some of the most beautiful and artistic work is being done in world building through these through these different games that people are building. So being interested and excited about those things, I follow some live streaming gamers just to stay up to date with all the different things that are going on. So there's some of them I can't watch because they're gross. But
some of them go too far, but we're big Nintendo kids around here. So Lucas is already, well, Annabelle too. She's a Mario Kart fanatic, but we love Nintendo. So he's already into a lot of the things I'm into because I've carried that over from my childhood. I couldn't agree more. It's an art form, especially with regards to myth, that we can really engage our kids about. So that's great for those of you listening who have children who enjoy video games, and really great advice. Thank you. I've forgotten about Dr. Craig's books. I saw them some time ago. To check those out. So
great picture books for little kids.
Good. Well, okay. I mean, I think those were all my questions. Did we miss anything?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I think we're good, but you don't have any other questions?
I think I'm good for now. I mean, I'm sure I'll think of something as soon as you leave, but this is great. I think I got all of them off of Facebook, and I hope people will have a chance to catch this if you didn't catch us live. And thank you, Professor Sharp, for joining us.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Of course. All right. We'll see you guys next time. God bless.